My name is Dr. Emily Thompson, and I am a forensic doctor in New York City. Most people think that working with corpses hardens you, that you eventually become immune to what the inert bodies have to tell you. The stories that are hidden between their bones, between the lacerations on their skin, or the bruises that reveal the secrets of their last moments. I have become accustomed to seeing death in all its forms. But that night, I learned that there are things that not even a forensic doctor can understand. It was 2 in the morning when I received an urgent call. A homeless man had appeared lifeless in an alley in the historic center. The police suspected a violent death, but no one seemed to have details. My team had already finished the shift, and the morgue was empty, so I decided to work alone. The silence of the laboratory is usually an ideal companion, but that night it felt different. The neon lights flickered more than usual, projecting in constant shadows that seemed to move on the walls as if they were alive. The body lay on the metal table, covered with a hospital sheet that barely hid its thin figure. His feet were ungainly, sticking out from the gray fabric, and with ingrown toenails, it looked like he had walked for miles barefoot. I pulled back the sheet and looked at him. He was a man of about 60 years old with a rough beard and spots on his skin that betrayed a life of homelessness and abandonment. His mouth was open in a kind of rictus, as if he had stopped in the middle of a silent scream. His eyes were closed, although there was a slight pressure on the eyelids, a tension that was not found in other corpses. Something in his expression made me deeply uncomfortable. I took a deep breath and turned on the recorder, preparing to begin the autopsy. Case number 0428, male, approximately 60 years old. My voice resonated in the laboratory as if the echo stayed trapped in the walls. I examined the abdomen, looking for signs of external violence, but found nothing. However, when palpating the thoracic area, I felt a kind of unusual resistance under the skin, something that I could not immediately identify. It was then that I noticed there was a strange texture just below the ribs, something that seemed to move. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to explain the feeling, but when I touched the skin again, it seemed to have changed again, as if what I had felt had disappeared or had moved inside the body. The temperature of the environment suddenly dropped, as if someone had opened a door to another world. The skin of the corpse became more rigid, almost as if it resisted being opened. And then, as I prepared to make the first incision, something happened that made me doubt my own sanity. I was about to close his eyelids when suddenly 2 dead eyes, completely opaque, opened by themselves. They stared at me. I felt a pressure in my chest that almost took my breath away. I knew it was impossible. I knew he was dead, but those eyes were watching me in a way that I could not describe as anything other than conscious. It was as if it wanted to tell me something that I could not express with words, but that reverberated in the air of the morgue like an echo that no one else heard. I took a step back, unable to look away from that inert face. It's just a spasm, I tried to tell myself, although my voice sounded so weak and broken that I did not believe it. I closed my eyes again, trying to control myself, but I had barely closed them when they opened again. This time, I felt his gaze boring into the depths of my being, as if he were tearing something inside me, digging into my own thoughts, into my own fears. I swallowed and, with trembling hands, forced myself to continue with the procedure. The surgical scissors penetrated his skin with difficulty, as if he were resisting being exposed. I opened his chest and discovered that his heart was completely blackened, as if it had been charred. The skin around the organ was dry and torn, but the heart itself seemed to be beating. I leaned towards him, unable to believe what I saw, and it was then that I heard a faint sound, a whisper that arose from the body itself, like a voice trapped inside. "Help me." I stepped back, stumbling over the table behind me. There was no one in the laboratory, only the echo of that voice that resonated in the walls and in my mind. I felt the pulse of my heart beating strongly, mixing with the murmur that seemed to arise from every corner of the morgue. But that body, that dead body, kept looking at me, and in its eyes, there was something more than simple death. The temperature dropped even more, and the air became thick, laden with a smell of age and putrefaction that did not come from him. There was no logical reason for what was happening. But then, looking again, I saw something that broke any notion of reality I had had until that moment. Under his skin, something began to move again, a kind of dark shadow that repaired from his abdomen to his neck, deforming his flesh from the inside. It was as if something was inhabiting the corpse, using it as a shell. My skin bristled as that thing snaked under his flesh like a parasite seeking to break free. I felt an uncontrollable impulse to flee, but my body did not obey me. I was trapped, hypnotized by the horror in front of me. Suddenly, the shadow under the skin stopped. The man's face slowly turned towards me, and his mouth began to open. Only this time, it was not an empty rictus. It was a smile, a twisted and grotesque smile that I had never seen on a corpse. His eyes, still open, seemed to mock me, as if they knew that I was not capable of doing anything to stop it. "What are you?" I managed to whisper, although I didn't expect an answer. Then I saw a movement behind his throat, something that went up and down like an insect trapped in a jar. And before I could do anything, a dark shadow came out of his mouth and, like a whip, it launched itself towards me. I gave a gasp, trying to get away, but I felt a weight on my chest, as if the shadow was absorbing something from me, something essential that kept me anchored in my own body. The pressure was unbearable, a deep pain that went through my skin and sank into my bones. Somehow, I managed to get away and staggered back. It wasn't just death that I saw in them, but a promise, a message that this wasn't over. I closed the morgue immediately and, without giving any explanations, I ran to my car. When I got home, I tried to distract myself, but something inside me had changed. In the reflection of the mirror, my eyes seemed darker, as if something in me had been extinguished. In the nights that followed, I began to experience hates of sleep paralysis, but they were not common. I felt the weight of that being, that shadow, on my chest every time I tried to close my eyes. His rotten breath filling my nostrils, the sensation of something cold and damp on my skin. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they became a constant backdrop to my thoughts. Weeks went by, and the horror didn't leave me. Every time I looked at a corpse in the morgue, I saw that shadow crawling under the skin, as if it were stalking me, as if it were waiting for the moment when I would let my guard down. I began to doubt my own sanity, and the job that used to be my life became a sentence. One night, unable to bear it any longer, I went to the morgue with a fixed idea. I took out the homeless man's file and examined the notes, looking for something, anything that would help me understand what had happened. Then, in the corner of the report, I found a note written in a different ink, as if someone had added it later. As soon as I read that note, I felt a cold shock down my spine. It was as if somehow that message was speaking directly to me. I felt watched. Even in the solitude of the morgue, where only the dim glow of the flickering fluorescent lights illuminated the silence. Suddenly the murmurs returned, soft whispers like a distant echo that I couldn't understand. But that didn't stop. I dropped the file, unable to bear the fixed gaze of the corpses that seemed to surround me in the shadows. I turned quickly, feeling something moving behind me, something dark and dense like the void itself taking shape, a parasite of death crawling among the corpses. Since that night, the days became an endless parade of horrors. I couldn't sleep. Every time I tried to fall asleep, that shadow, that I saw that first time in the homeless man, came back to torment me. I saw it in the corner of my room, in the reflections of the windows, and above all, in the eyes of the corpses on my work table. Although I tried to dissuade it, although I fought with all my strength to ignore it, I knew there was no way to escape from that shadow, that presence that had attached itself to me, that had marked me with its icy touch. The weight on my chest grew heavier, the whispers more frantic, until they became a scream that only I could hear. And in the darkness, I wait, knowing that it's only a matter of time before the shadow returns, before it finishes what it started that night in the morgue. I will leave my name anonymous, but I can assure you that what I will tell you is absolutely real. I am a forensic doctor in Chicago, and although I have seen more corpses than any person should, there was a case that left a mark on me. I could say that that night changed my life, or at least my way of seeing death. Since then, reality seems to me a thin layer of tranquility under which things lurk that I would rather not know. That cold afternoon in July, I was in the morgue, a place that out of habit had stopped seeming gloomy to me. However, that day, the atmosphere was strange, as if an invisible shadow had settled over everything. The bodies lined up awaited my attention under a pale, almost metallic light. I was preparing to close the night's file when a nurse knocked on the door in a hurry. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking as he held a stretcher with a body covered by a bloody sheet. "He arrived this morning," he muttered, avoiding looking me in the eyes. "Nobody wants to touch him. I didn't give it any importance. In the morgue, superstitions and rumors abound among the staff, so I went over to take a look. When I removed the sheet, I felt an inexplicable chill. There was the corpse of a woman of about 40 years old, thin and with an emaciated face, as if I had seen her myself. I had drained her. But what worried me was not her appearance, but her eyes were half open, fixed on an indeterminate point on the ceiling, and a thin layer of blood ran down her cheeks as if she had been crying. The record indicated that she had been found dead under strange circumstances, alone in a ruined house on the outskirts of the city. Her neighbors had spoken of her as a kind of hermit, someone who did not associate with anyone and who they accused of practicing strange things. They whispered that she was a witch who had dark powers, and that when she died, she had cursed those who touched her. Although I am not superstitious, I must admit that the atmosphere in the room was becoming increasingly heavy. I decided to start the autopsy as soon as possible to finish quickly. So, I began by cleaning her face, removing the dried blood from her cheeks. It was at that moment when I felt an inexplicable impulse to look towards the door, as if someone was watching me. The room was empty, but a dense, almost tangible energy filled the air. I shook my head, attributing them to my imagination. But the true horror began when I looked at the woman's face again. The cheeks were again furrowed by threads of blood in the same place where I had cleaned them just a few seconds ago. I remained mobile, trying to find a rational explanation. I checked her blood vessels, her tissues, looking for some logical explanation, but there was no reason for that strange phenomenon. The skin was dry, pale, without any sign of post-mortem activity that justified that sudden appearance of blood. I tried to concentrate on the analysis. I placed the instruments in order, and as a standard procedure, I began to make the incision in his chest. The scalpel blade barely touched his skin when a freezing wind blew through the room, turning off one of the lights on the ceiling, leaving me in darkness. My hands began to tremble, and I had to make a monumental effort to calm down. I was alone, but I felt as if someone or something was in the room with me. The next step was to open the thoracic cavity to observe the internal organs. But when I made the first cut, a thick, dark fluid gushed out of his chest with unusual pressure, staining my apron and even my hands. It smelled different, denser, almost sweet, as if something inside had corrupted in an unnatural way. There was no medical reason for that type of accelerated decomposition. I felt the blood in my veins freeze. Logic told me that I should continue, finish quickly, and close the case, but my instinct screamed at me to leave the room. However, my profession had taught me to control those impulses. So, I continued while I extracted the woman's heart. I noticed something disturbing. The structure was abnormally deteriorated, as if it had aged decades in a matter of hours. Its tissues were dark and gave off a foul odor that made me nauseous. The ventricles were atrophied, and the main arteries were almost completely obstructed by a black substance like solidified ash. The scene was grotesque, but in a way almost hypnotic. While I analyzed that putrefied organ, a current of icy air crossed the room. I looked towards the door, but it was closed. I clenched my teeth, trying to ignore the feeling that I was not alone. I convinced myself that the tiredness and the gloomy atmosphere of the morgue were playing with my mind. I focused on the corpse again, but as soon as I resumed my work, I heard a whisper. It was barely audible, a murmur that seemed to come from the walls or even from the body itself. The sound was rhythmic, almost a song, although I didn't recognize the words. I felt each syllable pierce the air and sink into my skin. In my mind, the lights flickered, and the woman's face seemed to tense as if a shadow moved it. Under her skin, she reanimated in a macabre grimace. I walked away, stumbling over a table, and my mind tried to rationalize what was happening. There was no way that was real. I approached cautiously, willing to check that they were only illusions caused by the tension. But the vision became even more disturbing. The cheeks were stained with blood. I could not stand it any longer and left the room, looking for a breath of fresh air. I leaned against the wall, trembling, trying to regain calm. The hallway was deserted, but the echo of the whispers still resonated in my mind. I thought about abandoning the autopsy, closing the case as a death without further details, but I knew that could cost me my career. I made an impulsive decision. I would return and vary with that. When I returned to the room, I found her immersed in the gloom, which was even more oppressive. My hands were cold, but I was forced to hold the scalpel tightly and resume the procedure. However, as soon as I touched the body again, an invisible pressure fell on me. It was as if a dark force was watching, evaluating every movement, every breath. Then the worst happened. I felt something slide through my fingers. A soft but icy wet texture coiled between my hands, squeezing me with an impossible force. When I looked, I discovered horrified that the woman's fingers, rigid and inert until that moment, now held my hand with a cold and stony firmness like that of a statue. I tried to break free, but her grip intensified, and at that moment her eyes, those half-open eyes full of shadows, were fixed on mine. There was no longer life in her gaze, but it was not empty either. It was as if something older and more malignant was inhabiting that corpse, looking at me from the other side, evaluating my fear, my desperation. I felt trapped like an insect under the magnifying glass of an ancient and cruel god. I heard my own rapid and intermittent breathing mixing with a murmur that grew in intensity. And then the lights flickered one more time and went out completely. Silence fell on the hall like a suffocating blanket, and then the laughter was a low gurgling sound, as if it came from a throat that hadn't made a sound in centuries. I don't know how long I lay there, motionless, trapped in that oppressive darkness with the cold hand of the dead woman clinging to mine. I felt like I was on the edge of madness, trapped in a limbo between reason and sadness. Finally, when the lights came back on, her hand was no longer in mine, and the body lay on the table again, inert as if nothing had happened. But the marks on my hands, the pressure grooves on my skin, told me it hadn't been an illusion. That night, I finished the autopsy in a semi-automatic state, like a body without a mind, with each movement directed by an incomprehensible inertia, as if an alien force was pushing me to the task. I avoided looking at the woman's face, ignoring the increasingly insistent whisper in my mind, that dark voice that kept dripping into my conscience like a drop of water eating away at rock. I knew I had to finish, close the case, and not think about that night anymore. When I finally finished, the morgue lights turned on and off one last time, as if something had decided to retreat from there. The energy in the room, although still heavy, was no longer as suffocating. I covered the body and pushed it towards the storage compartment, closing the door with a sigh of relief. However, as I prepared to file the file, I heard a subtle noise, barely a murmur that I thought came from the storage door. I looked towards the cold panel, towards where the woman's body lay, and in the absolute silence, the sound was repeated, a whisper, like a name pronounced with an almost maternal sweetness. There was no room for error. The voice came from the compartment. I thought about not opening it. Logic told me that I should leave, forget everything, and report only what was strictly necessary. But a morbid curiosity, like a suicidal impulse, pushed me to approach. My breathing was a silent gasp as I slowly slid the compartment door. The sheet was in its place, corpse bucket, but something in the way it settled on the body made me frown. Slowly, I removed the canvas, and then I saw her again with her eyes half open, looking at me. Her mouth had adopted a slight curve, a trace of a smile that looked like a grimace of mockery. This time, it wasn't the blood on her cheeks that disturbed me, but a word engraved on her skin, as if it had been written with sharp nails on her arms and chest. Letters were drawn that formed a warning. You touched her, I felt the impulse to back away, to leave everything and run away, but my legs seemed anchored to the ground. My eyes scanned the words, and a feeling of panic was enveloping me. Something was watching me, something that didn't belong to this world and that seemed to have found in me its next target. The cold of the steel and the metallic smell of the body flooded my senses, leaving me in a state of paralysis that was almost worse than death. When I was finally able to move, I backed away until I hit the wall. My hands trembled uncontrollably. What did that mean? Why was she addressing me? I couldn't give her a logical answer. Nothing of what was happening could be explained with reason. It was as if I had entered a nightmare and had lost the way out. Finally, I closed the compartment, making sure that the door was firmly sealed. I couldn't stand a second longer in the morgue, and I left without saying goodbye, walking through the long corridors that seemed to extend in time, distorted by my fear and the echo of my footsteps that resonated strangely, as if it weren't just me who walked in them. That night, I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt the weight of the woman's gaze on me. Her face appeared in the darkness. Her lips whispered words that I didn't understand, full of an ancient hatred, something that seemed much older than any of us. On the third day, insomnia and fear had me on the brink of madness. The shadow of death seemed to be breathing down my neck. It was then that a new report from the morgue arrived to me. The woman's body had disappeared. The nurses who had kept her in the compartment stated that when they opened it in the morning, the woman was not there. They only found a light layer of blood on the metal tray and the wrinkled sheet, as if it had been left there carelessly. No one had an explanation, and the entire team was terrified. In my mind, the warning of that last word resonated. You touched her. There was something in that touch that had linked me to her. I had crossed a threshold I shouldn't have. In every shadow, in every dark corner, I saw her face, opening her eyes, watching me, studying herself, perhaps lurking from somewhere between life and death. The days turned into weeks, and the ghost of that woman wouldn't leave me alone. Her image grew sharper in my mind, her eyes more alive, her voice clearer. I began to hear her even in the street, when I passed by dark windows or turned corners. She whispered my name in a soft, icy voice that ran down my spine like an ice claw. Finally, unable to stand it any longer, I returned to the house where the woman had been found dead. It was an old, ruined structure, suffocated by weeds, and with broken windows like the toothless mouth of a forgotten corpse. The door was ajar, and as I crossed it, a familiar stench of blood and rot filled my lungs. I entered the darkness, listening to the creaking of the boards under my feet. In the center of the main room, where dust was accumulating in thick layers, I found a low table covered with strange objects. Jars with dark liquids, herbs, dry figures carved in wood and bone. The atmosphere was suffocating, and the darkness seemed to move around me as if it were alive, breathing. It was then that I saw it in a dark corner near a peeling wall. A figure was watching me. Was it her or something that bore her form, with the same emaciated face, her eyes half open, and a macabre smile curving her lips? Her body was shrouded in shadows, but I could see the furrows of blood on her cheeks. Slowly, she began to approach. Her rigid movements were almost as if her flesh was attached to invisible threads. I tried to back away, but I realized that I was trapped, paralyzed by her gaze. Her face came closer to mine, and I could feel her breath, cold and heavy like the wet earth of a grave. Her lips opened, and from them came a frozen whisper full of hatred. "You belong to me," her voice said, resonating in my mind like an endless echo. I felt something break inside me, some kind of invisible chain that kept my sanity safe. The darkness enveloped me, and my body began to tremble, while she merged with the shadows as if she were fading into the air, leaving a mark on me, a kind of invisible seal. I don't know how much time passed until I woke up. I found myself on the floor, surrounded by a sepulchral silence, with the house plunged into an oppressive darkness. When I tried to get up, my legs trembled, and I realized that my wrist had a dark mark, a kind of bruise that formed a perfect circular line like a black bracelet on my skin. I returned to the city that same night, but something in me had changed. I felt the presence of the woman in every shadow, in every dark corner, and that mark on my wrist did not disappear. On the contrary, each day it grew deeper, darker, as if it were tattooed on my flesh. Sometimes, when insomnia consumes me and the night is so dense that I can barely breathe, I hear her laugh in my ear, soft and mocking, reminding me that she took me to thee and left me alive just to torment me. I know that someday she will come again, that the debt I have with her has not yet been settled. In every look I find in the empty hallways, in every dark reflection, I see her stalking, patient, alive now, caught between two worlds, waiting for the day when she finally comes to find me and claim what she thinks is hers. It was the year 1998, and I remember every detail as if it had just happened. I was 27 years old and had just started my residency at the Forensic Medicine Institute of Chicago. A dark, gloomy place, and at times unusual in its own stillness. I had been assigned the night shift, the dreaded resident shift. Although I had always heard rumors about strange things that happened in the morgue after midnight, I dismissed them. I was a man of science. Death and its phenomena did not inspire fear in me, or at least that's what I thought. My first night was a storm of sounds and whispers as soon as I crossed the doors of the institute. The atmosphere changed. It was as if the air became denser, as if I was enveloped by an invisible blanket that covered everything. I walked through the dimly lit hallways to the morgue, a cold, icy space full of steel stretchers and numbered metal drawers. That place seemed to be the cradle of absolute silence, broken only by the occasional hum of fluorescent lights. Around 2 in the morning, while reviewing the files of the admitted bodies that day, I heard a distant sound, something barely perceptible. I stopped and listened. The sound came from the back of the morgue, from the last row of drawers. A whisper or maybe a moan, like a soft lament that died away in the air. I thought that maybe it was the old and abandoned building complaining about the humidity and the passing of time. But while I returned to my work, the sound persisted, as if it came from somewhere deeper. The laments increased and transformed into weak voices. My skin crawled, thinking that I was alone, or maybe I wasn't. I approached the back, trying to convince myself that it was nonsense, just an acoustic effect of the metal structure. When opening one of the drawers, a thick smell of putrefaction hit me in the face, a stench so penetrating that I almost fell backwards. It was as if the air was contaminated, saturated with death and pain. I immediately closed the drawer, but the aroma was already impregnated in the room, stuck to my clothes, to my skin. During the following hours, the whispers did not stop. They were different voices, distant voices that seemed to pronounce words in a language I could not understand. It was an incessant murmur that pierced my ears, a cacophony of voices old, trapped in that frozen space, echoing in every corner of the morgue. I tried to continue with my tasks, ignore the whispers, concentrate on the paperwork, on the anatomical structure of the corpses I had to inspect, but the voices became more and more persistent, closer. I decided to leave the room, breathe fresh air, get away from that overwhelming environment. But when I crossed the threshold into the hallway, I felt something indescribable. A cold not the kind that makes your skin goosebumps, but a cold that sinks into your bones. A thick, sticky smell, as if the air were dense and viscous. I looked around, and the hallway seemed darker than usual, as if the shadows had gathered in the corners, lurking. I returned to the morgue, trying to distract myself with something, anything. However, when I opened the folder of a file, I noticed something strange. There was a stain on the page, a dark, almost invisible mark that extended in lines, as if they were veins on the paper. I shuddered. I felt that it was a warning, a silent message that I still could not decipher. The night moved forward, and the sound of the voices increased as if the morgue was filling with an invisible crowd. Sometimes I heard my name among the whispers, as if something was trying to get my attention. Every time I turned, I expected to see a figure in the shadows, a disfigured face, but the room was always empty. Just me, just the bodies, just the silence full of whispers. Then something happened that took away any glimmer of logic I had left. Around 3 in the morning, when sleep began to drag me towards absolute exhaustion, one of the lights began to flicker. The intermittent light filled the space with fleeting shadows that danced on the walls, creating strange, grotesque, impossible shapes. I felt that those shadows were alive, that they moved to a secret rhythm that I could not understand. And then I heard the blow. It was dry, loud, as if something had fallen on the cement floor. I turned around with my heart in my throat, looking for the source of the sound, and I realized that one of the drawers was open. Impossible, I thought. I had closed them all before sitting down to review the files. I approached with my body paralyzed by terror, my hands trembling at the edge of each step. As I peeked out, I felt an indescribable chill. The drawer was empty, but the inside of the door had marks, as if someone had scratched the metal from the inside, trying to get out. I leaned back with my heart pounding in my ears, unable to understand what I was seeing. The marks were recent. The metal was slightly bent at the edges, as if someone had forced the door from the inside. I felt the air in the room grow heavier, as something indescribable and dark surrounded me, watching me from every corner, from every shadow. I looked around, and the flickering lights seemed to increase that feeling of being trapped, as if that place was alive and hungry. The hours passed slowly in an endless torture. The voices turned into cries, into muffled screams, and then into pleas. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, that exhaustion and fear were making me hear things, but there was something undeniably real in those laments. It was a visceral sound of desperation and pain that seemed to come from a place that did not belong to this world. At 5 in the morning, the last event made me decide to never work alone in the morgue again. I was filing the files when I heard a voice, clear and strong, behind me. "Do not leave me here." I froze. The voice was feminine, loaded with an indescribable pain. When I turned around, I saw him at the end of the morgue, standing between the open drawers. There was a man. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were sunken, dark like empty wells. There was no life in his face, only an expression of deep suffering. He looked at me without blinking, with an intensity that pierced my soul. I felt like I was fainting. My legs were weakening. When I blinked, the man had disappeared. I fell to my knees, panting, my body trembling uncontrollably. That was my last night alone in the morgue. When the others arrived, nobody believed me. They looked at me with a mocking expression, as if it were just a bad joke. But since that night, something changed at the Institute. The doors of the drawers seemed to open by themselves. Small murmurs could be heard in the hallways, and the stench of putrefaction seemed to have permeated every corner of the place. Some later residents also began to report strange things. Shadowy voices, knocks. It wasn't long before the morgue of the Institute of Forensic Medicine gained a dark reputation, feared among residents and workers. Absolutely no one wanted to stay there alone at night. Years have passed since that experience, but every night when I close my eyes, I can hear the murmur of those moans. The Institute is still the same, and I wonder, when I see the reports, how many other doctors have seen what I saw? How many have heard the pleas of those trapped souls unable to find peace? I never worked night shifts again, and every time I pass by the Institute, I feel like something is watching me, that the empty eyes of that man are still there, waiting, calling me at night. The memory of that voice, "Do not leave me here," still echoes in my head. I am a forensic doctor in a small town in Arizona. Most days, the work is routine. Lifeless bodies, documents, analysis, files. Death has a language of its own, cold, methodical, and in a certain sense, quiet. But sometimes that world of silence breaks, and something inexplicable, something that has no place in the field of science, sneaks into the room. I remember well the day I was assigned the case of a 9-year-old boy, Julian, who had died under strange circumstances. They had found him in the river, trapped between rocks, his body soaked and cold, his skin pale with small cuts, and no signs of life. His family, destroyed by grief, stayed in the morgue until late at night, waiting for answers, any explanation that could ease their pain, even in a small way. But nothing they would find in that autopsy would ease their souls. In fact, I don't think it would ease anyone. That night, the morgue was silent as usual. The fluorescent lights hummed weakly, and the gloom crept through the corners as if patiently observing every movement. Sometimes I think the morgue has its own character, as if it stored the echo of the souls that once filled those empty bodies. From the beginning, with Julian, I felt something unusual, something I couldn't describe precisely, but that filled me with a constant chill. When I began the autopsy, I was alone with myself and the child's body. The first incisions were quick and professional. After so many years of experience, almost all movements become automatic. But that night, my hands were shaking. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt that someone was watching me. Every time I passed the scalpel over his pale skin, I felt the presence of a gaze, as if something or someone was watching my movements from the shadows. The preliminary analysis revealed nothing out of the ordinary. The water had filled his lungs. The cause of death seemed to be a simple drowning. Although there was something in his expression, on his small face, there was a slight grimace, as if his lips were about to sketch a smile or a gesture of discomfort. It seemed strange to me, but it was just an observation, nothing relevant to the report. I continued, trying to ignore the growing feeling of discomfort that was creeping up my back. And then it happened. While I finished closing the incisions on his body, I heard a soft, weak laugh, almost like a whisper. It was an innocent, childish laugh, but at the same time, loaded with something that froze my blood. I stopped my hands and looked around, hoping to find some logical explanation. Maybe someone had left a radio on, or maybe it was my mind playing tricks because of the tiredness. But in that room, there was nothing. Not a radio, not an open window, nor anyone. I felt a knot in my stomach and tried to convince myself that it was a hallucination, a simple failure of my brain. But when I returned my attention to the body, I heard it clearly. "Thank you for helping me." The voice was barely a murmur, but it was clear enough to make every hair on my body stand on end. I dropped the scalpel from my hands and took a step back, not knowing what to do, unable to process what had just happened. The voice was warm, grateful, as if the child was really there, thanking me for something I didn't understand. I left the room immediately, with my heartbeats echoing in my ears like a drum. I decided not to work night shifts again after that, not only because of the fear that had invaded me, but because I felt that there was something in that morgue that had stayed with me, something that had woken up and that I didn't want to leave me alone. In the days that followed, I tried to lead a normal life, filing in forms, filling out papers, avoiding the disturbing thoughts that came back to my mind every time I closed my eyes. But inevitably, every night when I was alone in my room, the same soft and distant laughter filled the silence, and I felt that someone or something was watching me. I began to suffer from insomnia. The memories became part of my face, and my mental health began to deteriorate. However, I did not dare to tell anyone. Who would believe me? One night, after several days of ignoring those murmurs in the darkness, I decided to face my fear. I wanted to convince myself that everything was a consequence of the stress of the hours in the morgue and the sadness accumulated by the tragedies of each day. So, I took the keys and went back to the autopsy room to put an end to this nightmare that was ending my sanity. The morgue was empty. The hallways were long and cold. The echo of my footsteps resonated in a way that made the space seem much larger and emptier than usual. Finally, I reached the room where I had worked on Julian's body. Everything was in its place, immaculate, as if nothing had happened. But when I turned on the lights, my eyes fell on the auto table, and I felt a pang of deep terror. There on the metal surface were small marks, handprints, as if someone had placed their wet fingers on the cold steel. They were the prints of a child. My hands trembled at the sight, and a shiver ran through my body as I realized there was no way those prints were there. I tried to rationalize. Maybe some other coroner had brought another child. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But an inner voice screamed at me that it wasn't. Paralyzed, I looked around the room, and it was then that I saw something else. A small, thin shadow slid across the opposite corner of the room. It wasn't solid, but it had the clear shape of a child. It was there, watching me from the darkness. Its eyes had no shine. They were deep, like bottomless wells, and it smiled. That same grimace that I had seen on the corpse's face was drawn on its lips. I stepped back, stumbling over the equipment, and the moment the shadow seemed to move towards me, an invisible force pushed me towards the door. I felt a pressure on my chest, as if something was dragging me towards the exit, forcing me to leave the room. When I finally broke free and managed to get out, the lights suddenly went out, leaving the place plunged into total darkness. I ran out of the morgue, and that night I didn't sleep. I didn't return to work for several days, claiming an illness. I couldn't explain it, but I felt that Julian, or whatever was left of him, wouldn't leave me alone. Days later, I returned to work, trembling, insecure, but determined to face whatever was happening. I decided to investigate the child's case thoroughly, reviewing police reports, statements from neighbors, anything that could explain to me the reason for his death or the reason for the manifestations. The story I discovered filled me with horror. Julian had been a lonely child. His mother said that he often talked to himself, mentioning an imaginary friend who lived in the water. The neighbors claimed to have seen him by the river many times, talking to someone who wasn't there, and he often came home soaked, even when it hadn't rained. They said that his face always showed a strange peace, as if someone was whispering secrets from another world to him. No one had given it too much importance, considering that he was just an imaginative child. But then, on a cold June night, Julian didn't return home. They found him the next day, trapped in the river, his body twisted between the rocks. The police considered it an accident, and so the case was closed. However, the truth was darker. In the town, there was an old legend about the river, about a presence that called lonely children to take them with her. They said it was the spirit of a woman who had lost her son, and that every year she chose a child to take to the water, sucking his life little by little until he was finally trapped at the bottom of the river. The legend sounded absurd, like a campfire story, but there was something in Julian's case that made me think that this legend contained something of truth. In a desperate attempt to close this chapter, I returned one last time to the morgue. This time, I carried a small candle and prayed softly, asking that Julian's soul find peace. As I whispered the words, I felt a presence, something warm and sad, as if the child was there, listening to me, waiting. The soft laughter was heard once more, but this time it was not terrifying. It was rather filled with sadness. At the end of the prayer, the atmosphere seemed to lighten. I left the morgue without looking back, feeling that, at least for now, Julian had found the peace he was looking for. Since then, the laughter stopped chasing me. However, every time I pass near the river, I feel a presence, a chill on my back, and I wonder if on the next June night, another child will hear the call of the water. I remember it was a routine case in a hospital in Phoenix. I had already worked for several hours without rest in a forensic room with oppressively cold walls under a fluorescent light that barely flickered. I had been in the business for years. I had seen everything. Dead people of all kinds, natural deaths, terrible accidents, and of course murders that seemed torn from nightmares. At this point, the bodies did not speak to me, but they did whisper stories of violence, sadness, and mystery. That night, however, was different. It marked a before and after, and to this day, it torments me with an intensity that sometimes makes me question my own sanity. It was the body of a young woman, about 30 years old, with pale skin and black hair that spread like a blanket around her lifeless face. She had been found on the outskirts of the city in an abandoned ditch, as if she were a broken doll. Her skin showed signs of blows and cuts, but what really disturbed me was the expression of her open eyes, fixed on the void with a mixture of horror and something else. A trail of dried tears stained her cheek, and her mouth was slightly open, as if in her last moments she had tried to scream but without success. While I inspected her body on the steel table, that's when I heard a soft, almost whispered melody, a lullaby. It was so light that at first I thought it was my imagination. a trick of my exhausted mind. However, the song continued unchanged and seemed to come from somewhere inside the room. I put the scalpel aside and looked around, bewildered. It was impossible that someone else was in the morgue at that hour. I myself had closed all the doors. I approached the wall, looking for the origin of that ethereal sound that now seemed to increase in intensity. I could clearly distinguish the notes of the melody, as if someone was trying to lull me, or worse, as if they were trying to lull the corpse on the table. The song was old, but there was something about it that stirred up my childhood memories of dark nights at my grandparents' house, where we were told not to go out into the yard after midnight because the wind could talk. I shook my head, wanting to get rid of those absurd thoughts, and went back to the woman's body, trying to concentrate on the procedure. But the more I tried to ignore the melody, the louder it got in my head. I got to the point where, almost in a trance, I found myself moving my lips along with the song, as if I recognized it from some forgotten corner of my mind, without really knowing why. I decided to open the woman's abdomen. The official autopsy dictated that internal injuries had to be ruled out. However, the instant the incision tore her skin, the singing stopped. The melody suddenly stopped, as if a needle were scratching a vinyl record. The silence it left in its absence was even more disturbing than the song itself. I felt a drop of cold sweat run down my spine. The room was completely silent, but at that moment, I thought I heard a whisper, a slight whisper coming from the body itself. I leaned forward, trying to listen, but no, I managed to capture nothing but the deafening beating of my own heart. I wanted to finish the procedure as quickly as possible. Something in that corpse was oppressing my chest, but when I was going to close the incision, I noticed something strange. The woman's stomach had a slight bulge, as if something had lodged inside. I took the scalpel and, with almost involuntary precision, I opened the abdominal cavity, expecting to find a tumor or some unusual obstruction. I was not prepared for what I saw inside. The woman's stomach, there was an object wrapped in a dirty cloth, completely impregnated with a dark and viscous liquid. I removed it with extreme care, without understanding how it had gotten there. Slowly, I unwrapped the cloth and saw with a shiver down my spine that it was a rudimentary-looking rag doll with black button eyes that seemed to observe me with an almost human intensity. The doll was torn in several places and seemed to have been sewn by hand with threads of different colors, some of which were already frayed. I could not help but notice that it had dark spots on its body, as if it had also been the victim of some kind of violence. Then I understood, or thought I understood, that doll had been placed on the woman's stomach as some kind of offering or ritual. A shiver ran up my spine as I thought of the possibilities. What kind of person would do something like that? And worse yet, why? Just at that moment, I felt a freezing breeze on the back of my neck. There were no windows or ventilation that could explain that current. But the worst thing was that along with the cold air, I heard again the whisper, now clearer, closer. It was a broken and pitiful female voice saying, "Help me." I stepped back, dropping the doll on the table. I looked at the woman's face, looking for any sign of life in that face devoid of color, but her expression remained as inert as at the beginning, although now her lips seemed slightly pursed, as if a spectral smile was about to form. Without knowing how, I found myself moving my lips as if I were responding to the call, but I had no words to say. It was as if I was connected to her in a way that I could not understand, and each second that passed seemed like an eternity. Suddenly, an image formed in my mind, a blurry, foreign memory, but vivid. It was her, the woman, walking down a dark path alone and terrified, while a hooded figure followed her in silence. I could feel her fear, her helplessness, the pain in every step as she tried to run but her legs refused to obey her. I heard an echo of the song, that same lullaby melody echoing in her head until the moment she fell to the ground, exhausted and defeated. The vision suddenly released me, leaving me panting. I noticed that the air had changed. A rancid, sweet smell permeated the environment. My hands trembled, and I clung to the table so as not to fall as I felt the temperature drop more and more. The cold took over my body, freezing me to the bones. I wanted to run, but something prevented me from moving. It was then that I saw her to my right, A spectral figure began to form in the darkness of the morgue. Was she the same woman whose corpse lay in front of me? But now she floated, looking at me with eyes full of anguish and reproach. Her lips moved without making a sound, but I clearly understood what they were saying. Help me? The vision was so vivid that for a second, I forgot where I was and who I was. Only their plea remained, a heartbreaking need that called me from the other side of life. Without thinking, I took the rag doll and lifted it as if it were an offering, a bridge to free her from her torment. Then the silence was broken with a heart-wrenching scream, a scream that came from nowhere and everywhere at the same time. I felt my mind breaking under the weight of that voice, and I fell to my knees, covering my ears, trying to drown out the impossible sound that echoed in my head. I don't know how long I was there, but when the scream ceased, there was nothing. The woman had disappeared. The doll lay shattered on the floor, and the body on the table had an expression of peace that I had never seen before. I stayed there on my knees in the darkened morgue with the certainty that I had witnessed something that no one should ever have seen. Somewhere in the hospital, a clock struck midnight, and the lullaby melody resonated distantly like a warning that although that soul had gone, something or someone still remained in the room, watching from the other side of the veil. I left the morgue without looking back, leaving the door ajar, as if the last trace of that life could also escape. I could barely sleep, staying on the edge of a restless dream, awake at times with the echo of the melody resonating in my mind. Sometimes I thought I heard the woman's voice, as real as if she were in my room, whispering, "Help me," that froze my blood. But nothing was as disturbing as the vision that came to my thoughts in the quietest moments. Those dark and empty eyes of the rag doll looking at me from the floor of the morgue, as if they still contained a fragment of the agony of that woman. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a hallucination because of tiredness. Maybe I thought my mind had played a trick on me. But when I returned to the hospital, the first thing I noticed was the strange atmosphere that seemed like the morgue. A thick, almost tangible air that gave me the impression of descending into a much darker place. I went in and found the doll still on the floor, broken, dirty, and completely out of place. I felt a chill when I saw it there, and with an impulse irrational, I bent down to pick it up. There was no logic that pushed me to do it. It was as if something inside me needed to feel the weight of that object in my hands. As I lifted it, however, I noticed something I hadn't seen the night before. There was something inside the doll. With trembling hands, I opened one of the seams. I found a small piece of yellowed and weak paper hidden between the scraps of fabric. I carefully unfolded it, and on it, I found a message written in small, shaky handwriting. "He likes you to sing. If you do, he'll listen to you. If he doesn't, he'll find you." My pulse quickened as I read those words. I felt as if an invisible slab was pressing down on my chest, and in that instant, I heard in the distance the melody of the lullaby, this time much clearer, much closer. With the paper still in my hand, I left the morgue in a hurry, but the hallway seemed to lengthen before me, and the light flickered as I walked, as if reality itself were distorted. Then I heard footsteps. Slowly, the sound of light footsteps that followed the beat of the melody, footsteps that seemed to get closer and closer, as if someone or something was following me. I turned around, but the hallway was empty. Only the echo of those footsteps and the song remained, resonating in my head, chasing me like a living shadow. I ran, feeling something dark looming behind me, something I couldn't see but whose weight I felt in the air. When I finally reached the exit, the sound stopped. I looked back and only saw the morgue door slightly ajar, as if inviting whoever wanted to venture in. I couldn't help the impulse to close it, making sure that no one could cross that door in search of what now remained sealed in the darkness. For the following weeks, I tried to continue with my life, concentrate on other cases, and leave that night behind. But every time I found myself alone in the morgue or at home, I heard the melody. Sometimes at night, I thought I saw shadows move at the edge of my vision, figures that disappeared when I blinked. The worst happened a few weeks later. I had returned to the hospital after my usual schedule, looking for some documents I had left. The morgue was dark, and an irrational thought made me hold my breath as I approached. I didn't want to go in, I didn't want to even look. But an impulse, or perhaps a force that was no longer mine, forced me to open the door. There in the gloom, I saw a figure sitting at the steel table with black hair cascading around her pale face. It was she, the woman, watching me with the rag doll in her hands. And in that moment, I understood with an indescribable horror that she had not found peace, that something dark and voracious still kept her trapped, and that thing had now chosen me. The melody began to play, but this time it was not a distant whisper but a deep, cultural voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. "Sing with me," said the voice, so clear that I thought I heard it inside my own chest. Without being able to control my actions, my lips moved, singing that same lullaby, a song that I now recognized as an ancient invocation, a call to something inhuman. And as I sang, I felt my body grow cold. My heartbeats became slow and heavy, as if something was draining the life from my veins. In that instant, the figure at the table smiled, and her eyes, that before seemed full of supplication, now shone with an indescribable evil. It was then that I understood the truth. That dark being was waiting for someone vulnerable enough to open the door, and in my obsession to help her, I had fallen into her trap. With a desperate effort, I broke the melody on my lips and ran away from that room. I felt something following me, something that brushed my back, but I managed to get out of the hospital. Since then, I have tried to stay away from any dark place, any dimly lit corner where that song can reach me. But I know that it is still there, waiting, lurking, and that one day when I least expect it, the song will play again. And then, in the end, it will find me,